My name is Dinah Vale, 39 years old. 20 years ago, my father looked me in the eye and said, "You made your bed, lie in it." The words didn't come like thunder. They came like frost, settling in the seams of my coat, in the hollows of my collarbones, in the spaces grief leaves behind. He slammed the door so hard the porch light trembled, and suddenly I was a silhouette on a November stage I hadn't auditioned for, 19, terrified and pregnant, clutching the life inside me that no one in my family wanted. My brother stood behind him, half in the doorway glow, half in the kitchen's shadow, arms folded like he'd been practicing that posture in the mirror, a smirk ready the way some men keep a pocket knife. "Don't come back begging," he murmured. Not even loud, just accurate, as if he'd read the ending and didn't like the heroine. The screen door rasped across its track and caught, a shrill insect sound that felt like it would outlast us all. Through the window, I could see my mother with both hands on the edge of the sink. She was crying the way a person tries not to. Silent, throat tight, a shudder you feel rather than hear. She didn't come out. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she was too afraid of what it would mean to cross the threshold toward me. Later, I made 1,000 bargains with that moment. If she'd wiped her eyes sooner, if the faucet hadn't dripped so loud, if the hymn station hadn't been on in the background. But bargains don't rewrite history. They only waste breath. You have to understand the town. We measured everything by eyes on a Sunday morning. Who lingered at the donuts? Who clasped hands in the aisle? Whose collar was white enough to mean virtue? My father was a deacon, the kind of man people called pillar, and meant it. He wore his Sunday suit like armor and scripture like a weapon that could be aimed without leaving fingerprints. When he looked at me that night, he wasn't seeing his daughter, he was seeing a dent in his armor, a crack, a rumor, a sermon illustration gone wrong. The gravel driveway was long enough to do what gravel does, make music out of leaving. I stepped off the boards and the porch light swung me forward like a spotlight, announcing to the darkness that the show had begun. My duffel bag knocked against my thigh with each step, a metronome of exile. I could smell wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney and, God help me, hot dogs, because the Little League fundraiser at the field down the block never canceled for weather or scandal. The world kept doing its normal, and my life was breaking open like a pane of ice underfoot. Dinah. My name chased me once. My mother's voice, so small it was almost not a sound. I turned, because daughters turn, even when the world ends. She was only a shape behind glass. My father's shadow moved across her like an eclipse. The porch light blinked, caught itself, stayed burning. The door shut again. That was the second slam. It didn't need to be as loud as the first to count. The cold was the kind that finds bone fast. I pulled my coat tight and set my palm over my belly as if I could shield both of us from judgment and temperature with skin and intention. I'd thought, stupidly maybe, that when the moment came, my father would do something else, shout, pace, quote a verse that had once comforted me. Instead, he chose the simplest violence, refusal. He took a sentence and made it a wall. You made your bed. The bed he meant was shame. The lie he told himself was that shaming me would protect our name. I know that now. I didn't then. Then I only knew the driveway was gritty and the road unlit and the future unannounced. People like to imagine their breaking points arrive with trumpets or sirens. Most arrive with a porch light and a shut door and the neighbor's dog barking as if you are the offense. I walked because walking was the only verb left. The town thinned quickly. Gas station, feed store, the billboard with the baby's face, and the verse about being knit together in the womb, which would have been funny if it hadn't been cruel. I passed Mrs. Klein's shop window, where she'd arranged porcelain angels holding harps and candles, and one implausible golden trumpet. Their reflected faces overlapped mine in the glass, and for a second I looked accompanied. The bell on her door stayed silent. She turned the sign to closed without meeting my eyes. At Dana's apartment, a friend of the kind that keeps extra blankets because she knows her own past, I lay on the couch and pretended I could sleep. The radiator ticked its slow applause for survival. A bus hissed outside. My phone sat like a hot coal on the coffee table. I picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. I imagined calling my mother. I imagined my father grabbing the receiver first, that echoing anger, that terrible evenness. "Don't come crawling back." He didn't need to say it twice for me to hear it thrice. I put the phone on the floor. I put my hand back on my belly. My daughter kicked once, then again, a telegram. "I'm here." Those early days tasted like bleach and coffee and cheap soap. In the morning, I bussed tables at the diner where the vinyl seats squeaked and the bell over the door had one note, always the same. Men in camo caps let their coffee go cold while they discussed other people's choices. A retired gunnery sergeant named Walt tipped in advice as often as cash. "Ma'am," he'd say to me, and to the blueberry pie equally, "discipline starts where you stand." He showed me how to lace my boots so the blisters didn't win. He didn't ask about the father of my child. He didn't ask about my father. At night, I cleaned offices that smelled like toner and a kind of ambition I didn't yet recognize. The vacuum roared, and my mind finally shut up. I learned the weight of a trash bag full of paper and the weight of words said in kitchens. The first rent check I wrote shook the memory of my mother's grocery lists loose. The same looped G, the same stubborn R, like hands praying sideways. I bought a rotisserie chicken and made it last 3 dinners because you can stretch meat with onions and the right stories. I learned that hunger isn't only for food. Some nights I wanted my old house more than warmth, and then I would remember the door and the sentence and decide to want sleep instead. One evening, December's meaner cousin Wind found every unbuttoned idea I'd ever had. The neighbor's car I'd been borrowing coughed twice and sat down to die. So I walked home from the diner with the heat from the coffee urns still on my palms. Snow began the way it always does in this town, haltingly, as if asking permission. By the time I reached the bus stop, it had developed confidence. I sat because I couldn't pretend I wasn't tired anymore, and because pride has to take a seat sometimes to keep from fainting. The couple across the street rearranged their shopping bags and their laughter. Nobody looked twice. I cried. Not politely, the kind that folds you over your own knees. That's the truth. And because the world is sometimes kinder than your blood. A stranger sat beside me without asking for a story. She was a woman in her 60s with the kind of soft coat that makes a gesture out of warmth, and she handed me a thermos that clicked open with a satisfying, inevitable sound. "Honey," she said, like the word had permission, "God never wastes pain." It was not a sermon. It was a sentence laid on the bench between us like a clean handkerchief. I drank. The tea tasted like cinnamon and mercy. She didn't ask my name. She didn't need it. She waited until I could breathe without fogging the universe, and then she left, and her absence blessed me as much as her presence had. That night, on Dana's couch, with the radiator doing its unsteady best, and my daughter reminding me with small, insistent knocks that she was on my side, I made a decision that felt both small and seismic. I would not live my life trying to make my father wrong. I would live my life proving my child right, about me, about hope, about the way a door can shut and still not end a house. I didn't know the route yet. I only knew I could pick up a textbook or a mop with equal ferocity. I could stand in line for grants with my head up. I could sign up for a training program with a name I couldn't say without trembling. I could let strangers' kindness count without calling it weakness. I could bear the weight of a sentence meant to break me and use it like a plank in a bridge. Before I slept, I wrote 3 lines on the back of a diner receipt with a pen that left blots like constellations. 1. Apply for classes. 2. Ask about ROC. 3. Buy better socks. I stared at the list until it looked like a map. Then I folded it and tucked it under my pillow like children do with teeth and truths. Somewhere, not at my parents' house, a church bell marked the hour. I counted the notes like a promise. 1, 2, 3, 4, and decided that if my father had chosen his armor over me, I would choose a different kind of strength. The porch light still burned in my mind. I let it. A spotlight can be a warning or a benediction, depending on where you stand. I chose the sidewalk. I chose the road. I chose the long way home. The studio apartment I rented that winter was less a home and more a stubborn statement. Paint peeled from the walls in wide curls, as if the building itself had grown tired of appearances. The bathroom sink leaked in a rhythm that mocked sleep, and the radiator worked only when it felt generous. Still, the key was mine. The lock turned for me, and the door shut without anyone shouting. Sometimes survival looks like a place you can cry without being overheard. I worked at the diner during the day, and at night I cleaned offices downtown. The mop water stung my hands. My shoes carried the smell of grease that no soap could quite erase. And every morning, my belly stretched tighter beneath my thrift store blouse. But each kick inside me was a reminder I wasn't just working to exist. I was working for someone who hadn't even opened her eyes yet. That thought was fuel enough to keep me upright when my knees buckled. It wasn't lost on me that people from church, people who had once kissed my cheek on Sundays, sat at my section in the diner. They pretended not to notice me. Or worse, they noticed and whispered. A couple of women from the choir ordered coffee and pie, voices pitched too high as they said things like, "It's a shame what young girls throw away." I poured their refills steady, smiling like a waitress should. My father's words were louder than theirs anyway. There was one exception, Walt, a retired gunnery sergeant who tipped in wrinkled dollar bills and advice I didn't ask for but memorized anyway. "Ma'am," he said one morning, tapping the counter with a fork, "don't let blisters stop you. They're just proof you're walking farther than most." His words didn't make the shift shorter, but they made my stride heavier with intent. He noticed the name badge pinned crooked on my chest and straightened it without asking. "You wear your name straight, always," he said, "even when the world tries to tilt you." It was in that same week that a letter showed up, slid under my apartment door. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper with a sentence that rattled me. "I heard you're working late. You shouldn't walk home alone. No signature." The handwriting was familiar, but disguised, each letter too careful, like someone trying to imitate neatness. For days, I wondered if it was my brother Mark sending warnings in a coward's script, or maybe my mother, sneaking scraps of protection where my father wouldn't see. I tucked the note in the drawer under the socks I'd bought from a clearance bin. It wasn't a comfort, but it was a reminder. They were still watching, even if they pretended I didn't exist. By December, the snow came harder. The neighbor's car, the one I borrowed, sputtered into silence more often than not. One night, after closing the diner, I trudged toward home on foot. My coat refused to button over my belly now, and the wind pressed through every gap like a critic. I made it as far as the bus stop bench before I collapsed onto the cold metal, hands cupping the swell of my stomach. The snow fell thick enough to turn the street into a secret. Couples with shopping bags laughed their way past me, their arms linked, their futures secure. None of them stopped. That was the night I broke. Ugly crying, chest heaving, my breath fogging into the kind of clouds you can't hide. And that was the night the stranger appeared, a woman in her 60s, gray hair tucked under a knitted cap, eyes kind enough to meet mine without pity. She sat beside me as though we'd planned it, unscrewed a thermos, and pressed it into my hands. Steam rose between us like a fragile truce. "Honey," she said softly, "God never wastes pain." It was one sentence, but it pierced deeper than sermons I'd grown up with. I took a sip, cinnamon and tea sliding warmth down my throat. For the first time in months, I felt something other than shame or exhaustion. I felt seen. She didn't ask my name, and I didn't ask hers. She just sat long enough for me to breathe again, then stood and disappeared into the snow. I never saw her again, but I carried her words like scripture. Back in the apartment, I made a decision that felt heavier than the life inside me. I wouldn't live to prove my father wrong. I'd live to prove my daughter right, that she deserved a mother who stood, even when her legs shook, that she deserved a chance to grow up in a house where slammed doors weren't verdicts. I pulled a pen from my apron pocket and wrote on the back of a diner receipt, "Apply for community college. Ask about rock. Buy better socks." 3 lines, nothing heroic. But when I folded the paper and tucked it under my pillow, it felt like a vow. Over the next weeks, I chased that list. The college office smelled like dust and ink, the kind of place that forgets dreams until someone insists on them. I filled out forms with hands that shook, writing single on the line for marital status with a stab of reality. Grants and loans were words I didn't fully understand, but I circled them anyway. Then came ROC, Reserve Officer Candidate Training. The flyer I'd seen taped to a bulletin board at the diner seemed laughable at first. Me in uniform, me with discipline. But Walt's voice echoed, "Blisters mean you're walking farther than most." I signed up. Every step felt fragile, like walking across a frozen pond and praying the ice held. But my daughter's kicks inside me reminded me I wasn't walking alone. She was with me, urging me forward. At night, when the office hallways were quiet and my mop water went gray, I practiced repeating her words in my head. God never wastes pain. Sometimes I believed them, sometimes I didn't. But the echo kept me upright. I didn't know it yet, but those decisions, scratched onto a diner receipt, were the seeds of a life that would one day bring my father to his knees. The night she arrived, the walls felt closer than they ever had before. I was 20, my belly stretched full of urgency, the paint peeling above the bed, the leaky sink tapping like a metronome marking contractions. No midwife, no family, just me and the sound of my own breath splintering. I had thought labor would come with warning bells, but it came like a thief, stealing hours in waves. I gripped the side of the mattress, sweat slicking my palms, and told myself to be silent because neighbors complain and dignity sometimes hides in quiet. But silence broke with every contraction. I groaned into the pillow, prayed into the ceiling, cursed into the shadows. For a moment, between one pain and the next, I thought of calling my parents. The phone sat on the crate I used as a nightstand, the cord curled like a question. Would hearing their grandchild's first cry soften them? Or would my father answer with the same cold voice, the same door-slamming syllables? The next contraction gave me my answer. I screamed until the window pane shook. My daughter forced her way into the world the way hope often does, through blood and refusal, not permission. When her cry cut through the room, thin but fierce, I collapsed back, stunned at the sound. Tiny fists clenched, face wrinkled as if demanding apologies from the universe. I pressed her to my chest, my tears falling into her hair, whispering the only vow I had left in me. We're going to make it. Just you and me. The apartment smelled of bleach and iron, of fear and triumph. I wrapped her in the only blanket I had, a faded quilt from my grandmother, edges frayed, pattern nearly invisible. I thought of how my father used to bless the food at dinner, his voice booming with authority, and how he had used that same voice to exile me. I looked down at my daughter and swore that her first blessings would not come from thunder. They would come from whispers, from steady promises, from love that didn't require obedience as proof. I named her Emily, not because of anyone in our family line, but because it sounded like beginning. Her eyes, when they opened, were storm-dark and unyielding. I laughed through tears. You already know how to stare them down, don't you? The weeks after her birth blurred into a haze of exhaustion and resolve. Diapers stacked beside textbooks I'd borrowed from the library, bottles lined up next to a mop bucket, lullabies sung between paragraphs of grant applications. I learned to swaddle with one hand and highlight passages with the other. I balanced her on my hip while stirring beans on the stove, the smell of cumin and cheap rice filling the air. Poverty doesn't smell like nothing. It smells like everything stretched too thin. I carried her in a second-hand stroller to the diner each morning. The woman across the hall, Mrs. Larkin, watched her while I worked the breakfast shift. She was kind in the way people are when they've known both hunger and shame. You keep walking, Dinah, she'd say, rocking Emily with arms that shook from arthritis. That girl's going to see what grit looks like. But every kindness carried a shadow of fear. The letter I'd received weeks earlier, I heard you're working late, you shouldn't walk home alone, still haunted me. Sometimes at night, I swore I saw a figure leaning against a lamppost watching. Once, when I pushed Emily's stroller past the churchyard, I thought I saw my brother's car idling at the corner. By the time I blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe not. The line between being haunted and being followed is thinner when you've been cast out. Still, I pressed forward. Community college classes began. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I took notes with hands that still smelled of dish soap. English composition, American history, public speaking. The last nearly broke me. My voice trembled so hard I gripped the podium to stay upright. But when I looked down at Emily sleeping in her stroller at the back of the room, I kept talking. If I could speak while shaking, maybe I could live while breaking. At night, ROC training pushed me harder. Push-ups, runs, drills that made my lungs ache as though they'd never known air. I came last in every formation at first. But each time I thought about quitting, I saw that porch light again, burning above the slammed door, and I found another step. Pain became the only proof I was still moving. And through it all, Emily grew. Her laugh came early, startlingly bright in a room that had only known sighs. She learned to grip my finger tight, as if daring the world to try to take me away. Some nights, when I held her close, I thought of calling my parents again. But the fear of hearing his voice, the sneer in my brother's tone, outweighed the fantasy. Instead, I told Emily stories about women who made a life out of scraps, about courage that didn't wait for applause. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere my mother knew, that maybe she was reading the grocery list at the store and suddenly pausing, wondering what her granddaughter looked like, that maybe she was slipping coins into an envelope while my father wasn't watching, that maybe, just maybe, the note about walking alone had been hers. I carried that uncertainty like a secret weapon. If I couldn't have her hand, I'd have her shadow at least, and shadows can still point the way forward. The night Emily turned 3 months old, I stood by the window holding her, snow falling slow and forgiving outside. The apartment was quiet except for her soft breathing against my collarbone. I whispered into her hair, "One day they'll have to see you. One day they'll have to face us." She stirred, made a small sound that could have been agreement, could have been a dream. Either way, I decided to peg it as a promise. The first morning, I strapped Emily into a thrift store stroller and pushed her 3 blocks to Mrs. Larkin's apartment. The sun hadn't risen yet. The city was half asleep, street lamps humming, pavement slick with frost. My backpack thumped against my spine, heavy with textbooks I could barely afford, and every step whispered a question. Are you strong enough? Our own knee training didn't care about new mothers. It didn't care about sleepless nights or the ache in my body that hadn't yet recovered from childbirth. It cared about checklists, push-ups, and whether or not you showed up on time. The first day I lined up with the others, my uniform didn't fit right, my hair was tied back in a crooked knot, and shame crept up my throat. By the end of the run, I was at the back, lungs burning, vision blurring. I could almost hear my father's voice. "You made your bed." I spat onto the ground and found one more step, not for him, but in defiance of him. At the diner, Walt noticed my swollen knuckles from training. He slid a napkin across the counter with a list written in blocky letters: push-up progressions, interval runs, how to tape a blister. "Discipline starts where you stand," he reminded me. He never explained how he knew what I was chasing, but his eyes softened when he said it, as if he saw both the girl collapsing at the back of the line and the woman who refused to quit. Money was a constant knot. Gas bills arrived with red stamps, daycare costs pressed like stones on my chest, and I sold plasma twice a month just to keep the lights on. Yet somehow, each small humiliation sharpened my edges instead of dulling them. I stretched a rotisserie chicken across 3 meals. I sewed buttons with dental floss. I learned what true exhaustion felt like, the kind where you read the same sentence 3 times and it still won't stick. One midnight, walking home with Emily asleep in her stroller, a police cruiser slowed beside me. The officer leaned out, asked if I was all right. "I'm fine," I said, quick, defensive. He circled the block twice anyway. My skin prickled with the knowledge that I wasn't invisible after all, that sometimes being seen is just another kind of danger. Still, there were moments that felt almost holy. The morning I passed my first PT test without vomiting, Walt was waiting at his booth. I left an apple pie on his table on the house. He tipped $5 and gave me a grin that lasted longer than the sugar rush. "Told you," he said. "Blisters mean you're walking farther than most." And then there were the cracks in my resolve, moments I hated myself for missing. Emily's first steps happened in Mrs. Larkin's living room while I was at evening class, parsing American history dates under fluorescent lights. By the time I got home, she was already wobbling across the carpet with triumph in her eyes. I clapped and cheered, but the guilt carved deep. She deserved me at every milestone, and I was too busy trying to build a life worth handing her. The tension grew thicker when I started to suspect someone was watching. Once, after a long shift, I found an envelope taped to my door. No money inside, just a folded page. "Keep going. You're stronger than he knows." My father's handwriting was bold, unforgettable, but this one was disguised, careful, almost trembling. I pressed it against my chest and wondered, was it my mother slipping me hope while hiding from him? Or Mark, my brother, pretending indifference while keeping score from afar? The not knowing gnawed at me more than the words themselves. I carried the note in my backpack, tucked between textbooks. Every time I stumbled at training or felt too tired to stand, I touched the paper. I wanted it to be hers. I needed it to be hers. But fear warned me it could also be his. A trap, a way of reminding me he still held the strings. Church was complicated. I couldn't walk back into the building where my father preached about grace with a fist behind his back. Instead, I found a small congregation in a repurposed storefront between a laundromat and a payday loan office. No stained glass, just folding chairs, and a pastor with a battered guitar. When I cried during the second hymn, nobody asked questions. Ruth, a woman with silver hair pinned in a neat roll, started bringing casseroles just because. Her kindness felt like a quiet rebellion against every slammed door. By spring, my uniform began to fit better. My arms no longer shook during push-ups. My lungs found rhythm, and discipline became less punishment and more anchor. One morning, standing in the mirror before class, I barely recognized myself. Chin level, shoulders back, eyes steady. For the first time, I saw not just a girl exiled from her family, but a woman being forged by fire. But the price of that transformation was steep. Emily's daycare called to say I'd forgotten to sign a permission form. We lost our spot for a week. I carried her to class, rocking her stroller with my foot while trying to take notes. Some professors were merciful, others weren't. I overheard whispers in the hallway. The girl with the baby, the one whose father threw her out. Gossip traveled faster than facts. I told myself none of it mattered, as long as Emily knew she wasn't alone. Each night I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "One day, they'll have to face us." The words became less a threat and more a prophecy. Because even then, part of me knew that survival wasn't the end of the story. One day, survival would become confrontation. The day I wore the uniform for the first time, I stood frozen in front of the mirror in a bathroom with cracked tiles and a light that flickered like a nervous heartbeat. My hair was pinned back, my shoulders squared, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against my skin. For a moment, I couldn't move. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the girl who had cried on a bus stop bench in December. She was someone harder, someone steadier, someone I almost didn't recognize. When I stepped onto campus in that uniform, people looked differently. Some nodded, some smirked, but all noticed. I had become visible in a way I hadn't been since the night of my exile, except now it was by my own terms. Emily was waiting at home with Mrs. Larkin, but when I returned, I held her in my arms, lifted her high, and whispered, "We did it." Her tiny hands smacked my cheeks like applause. Commissioning day was not glamorous. The ceremony was held in a small auditorium that smelled of dust and sweat. My uniform fit better now. Sharp lines at the seams, polished boots catching the light. Emily wore a blue dress Ruth had found at a yard sale, the hem uneven, but her smile wider than the room itself. When the bar was pinned on my chest, her clapping echoed louder than anyone else's. I swallowed the ache that my family wasn't there. My father, my mother, my brother, they would never see this moment. But she did, and that was enough. That night, after Emily fell asleep, I sat alone with the photograph someone had taken of us. Me in uniform, her beside me in that blue dress, her hands reaching toward the insignia. I stared at the picture until my vision blurred. Pride warred with grief. They would never see the woman they had thrown away, reborn in fire. They would never know the cost of their absence. And yet some secret part of me wished my mother could at least glimpse this proof. Weeks later, I received my first email from her. It arrived from an account created at the public library. The subject line, "Just checking in." The message was short, weather updates, whether the geraniums had survived the frost, nothing about apologies or the past. She didn't ask about Emily, though she must have known by now. I read it 3 times, the words trembling between small talk and confession. I replied with a single photo, Emily coloring at the kitchen table, crayon smudges on her cheek. No explanation, no commentary, just proof of existence. The emails trickled in after that, Always tentative, always careful. Never a mention of my father. Never a hint of what she endured inside that house. I told myself to stop reading between the lines, but I couldn't help it. Each note felt like a woman trying to reach across a canyon without a bridge. Then came Christmas. I had no money for gifts, but Ruth insisted Emily deserved more than practicality. Every child needs magic, she said, pressing a wrapped box into my hands. Inside was a second-hand doll with a chipped porcelain face. Emily hugged it like treasure. I watched her and thought of the Christmases I'd spent wiring money home for my sister's lifestyle, my brother's tuition, my mother's shop. All those years I'd been the invisible backbone of a family that accused me of taking instead of giving. The irony was so bitter, it tasted metallic. A week after the new year, a card arrived. No return address, just a glossy photo of a family in matching sweaters at a tree farm. My brother, Mark, his wife, their children lined up like a magazine spread. On the back, in his slanted handwriting, "Hope you're well." That was all. No acknowledgement of my exile, no mention of Emily, not even a phone number. Just 4 words, neat and detached. I stared at the card for a long time before tucking it into the drawer with the folded notes I still kept. The one warning me not to walk home alone, the one telling me to keep going. The drawer became a graveyard of words that weren't enough. Meanwhile, work consumed me. I had found my lane: logistics, planning, moving people and resources like chess pieces. I learned to see 3 problems ahead, to say no when a yes would break the machine. I stopped flinching when someone raised their voice. I discovered I could fix mistakes without crumbling. Every day I carried proof that the girl on the bus stop bench had been replaced by a woman who could not be broken by slammed doors. Still, late at night, guilt circled back. I had missed Emily's first word because I stayed late practicing navigation. I had missed her first school recital because my class schedule wouldn't bend. She forgave me faster than I forgave myself, her arms always reaching, her trust unshaken. But I wondered how many cracks were forming in her that I couldn't see yet. It was during one of those nights, me hunched over textbooks, Emily asleep at my side, that I heard a knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 careful taps. When I opened it, no one stood there. Only an envelope lay on the mat, my name written in blocky letters. Inside, a single folded sheet. "You are stronger than he thinks. Keep going." No signature, no return address. I read it twice, then again. Was it my mother, my brother, or someone else entirely, an unseen witness? The mystery gnawed at me, but the words lodged themselves in my chest like armor. I pinned the note above my desk where it stayed, yellowing over time. Some nights I stared at it, whispering aloud, "Stronger than he thinks." I didn't know yet if that he was my father or myself. Years stacked like bricks, and suddenly survival had become structure. By the time Emily was in middle school, I had climbed higher in rank than I'd ever dared to dream. With each promotion came new responsibilities, new pressures, and eventually a house that felt more like a statement than a home. Brick and glass, 2 stories high, set back from the street with a wrought iron gate that clanged shut like punctuation. They gave me Albert. Not a butler, he never called himself that. He was the keeper of lists. A man with posture as straight as his pen strokes, hair gone silver at the temples, voice even and calm. He managed the small details so I could keep my head above the large ones. He ironed tablecloths like he was tucking children into bed. He polished the brass on the gatehouse bell until it flashed like a coin. He kept the ledger, where names and arrivals were written in careful block letters. "All present and accounted for," he'd say at the end of every gathering. It became his blessing, his benediction. Inside, I had built my own kind of refuge. Emily's library cards from every base we'd lived on were taped like badges inside a shoebox. Pictures lined the mantel, her at science fairs, me in muddy fatigues, a neighbor's barbecue where we laughed as if the past had never happened. I had carved a world where we belonged, a house without slammed doors, a gate that answered to me. But the past has a way of seeping under locked gates. It began with an email from my mother. Subject line, update. The message was longer this time. She wrote about weather, the geraniums again, but slipped in a sentence that made my hands still. Your father is not well. No details, no diagnosis, but I heard what she didn't write. His strength was thinning, the armor rusting. A week later, she called. I almost didn't answer. Her name flashing on the screen felt like a test. When I picked up, her voice was smaller than I remembered. He's stubborn, she said, but he listens to doctors better than he ever listened to me. She didn't ask for money, didn't ask for visits, just added quietly, I've told him about Emily. I've told him about you. The silence after that was a canyon. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall, but instead I set it down gently. Emily came into the kitchen, setting her backpack on the counter. She was 16 now, tall, steady, with eyes that had learned to read weather in people as well as in skies. That was Grandma, wasn't it? She asked. I nodded. And? She says he's sick. Emily studied me, then said, if you let them back in, make sure it's for you, not for them. Her words cut sharper than any sermon my father had ever preached. She wasn't a child anymore. She could see the weight I carried. I pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, I don't even know if I can. That night I walked the perimeter of the house, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the gate. It was more than iron and hinges. It was a question. Would I let them through? Would I let them stand on the gravel drive where guests had laughed and neighbors had arrived with casseroles? Would I let my father see the life I had built without him? Albert found me by the magnolia tree, ledger tucked under his arm. Ma'am, he asked gently, shall I be expecting any special guests? I hesitated, then said, not yet, but maybe soon. He inclined his head, clicked his pen, and wrote something anyway. When I asked what, he only said, I like to prepare for beginnings. 2 nights later, my mother left a voicemail. We can come if you want, not stay long. Mark can drive. Her voice faltered, then steadied. If you change your mind, just don't open the gate. I played it 3 times. Each replay felt like reopening a wound I had carefully stitched. I imagined Mark's hands on the steering wheel, his jaw set like our father's. I imagined my father in the back seat, righteous indignation worn thin, resentment riding shotgun. I imagined my mother clutching her purse, rehearsing apologies she didn't know how to finish. I stood in the kitchen, hands flat on the counter, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. 20 years of anger and longing circled inside me like dogs pacing a cage. I didn't know which version of myself would answer the door if they came, the exiled girl who had walked down the gravel drive or the officer who now commanded entire rooms without trembling. I brewed tea because that's what you do when there isn't a clear next step. I poured 2 cups, then set one back in the cupboard. Finally, I pulled out the guest list for the upcoming reception, pen hovering over the page. Slowly, carefully, I wrote, family. Then I crossed it out. Then I wrote it again, larger. Albert would need to know who to let through the gate. Saturday arrived like a held breath. The sky was pale blue, the kind of winter sky that sharpens every sound. The crunch of gravel, the whistle of a squirrel in the oaks, even the sigh of the gate hinges. The house had been made ready. Albert arranged poinsettias in clay pots at the entrance, polished the brass bell at the gatehouse, and straightened the wreath on the front door until it hung without flaw. Inside, the dining table gleamed, and the silver bowl by the door brimmed with RSVP cards from neighbors and colleagues. But beneath all that order, my pulse beat wild, as if my body knew the storm that was about to walk through my gates. I kept busy to steady myself, counting candles, reviewing reception notes, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth, but nothing kept the weight from settling on my chest when the gate intercom buzzed twice. Albert's voice carried through, low and reverent, like a man in church. Ma'am, he said, they've arrived. I froze, my hands flat against the counter, the same way they'd been the night of my exile, braced for impact. I didn't rush to the window. I didn't want to see them through glass like I had seen my mother once, helpless behind it. I wanted to meet them on my own ground. When the bell at the gatehouse rang, Albert's rhythm was unmistakable. 2 notes, courteous but insistent, demanding attention without shouting. I stepped onto the porch, the boards clean and sun-warmed, and for a moment I simply breathed. The driveway stretched long before me. The gate swung open like theater curtains, and beyond it idled a silver SUV with its blinker ticking. A second car waited behind it, rental tags hanging from the mirror. Albert, precise as ever, stood beside the SUV, ledger tucked under his arm. His courtesy was a shield, his posture deliberate, a balance between tension and kindness. He opened the passenger door. My mother unfolded herself from the seat, moving carefully, her wool coat one I remembered from long ago. A navy with buttons that had once belonged to my grandmother. Her hair was more silver now, her mouth quivering between a smile and an apology. She looked past the yard, past the trees, and found me instantly, the way a mother always knows where to look first. Mark got out on the driver's side, sunglasses too dark for the pale day, jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. He had aged into our father's profile, the ridge of the nose, the stance too wide, as if the ground needed claiming. He leaned against the car door as though it might hold him upright inside whatever story he'd brought to me. In the back seat, my father shifted. Even from a distance, I saw the hesitation, the cost of movement. He looked smaller than memory allowed. His authority no longer walked ahead of him like a herald. It clung to him like an old coat worn thin at the elbows. Albert's voice cut across the cold air, even and formal. "Good morning," he said. "Are you here to see General Vale?" The silence that followed was enormous. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Mark lowered his sunglasses slightly, as if gravity itself wanted him to see the truth. My father turned his face toward the voice, and for a heartbeat I thought he might stay in the car, let the years do his speaking for him. But my mother answered, her voice steady enough to carry. "Yes," she said, "we're here to see our daughter." Albert inclined his head, the gesture of a man recording history as much as granting permission. "Very good," he said. He stepped back, and the gate, obedient as a soldier, swung wider. I walked down the drive, stopping halfway, where the gravel narrowed into pavement. I didn't want to meet them at the gate like a supplicant, nor did I want to make them walk the full distance like petitioners. Somewhere in the middle felt right. Up close, the years were etched into all of us, new lines around eyes, shoulders bent differently, time's fingerprints everywhere. My mother's arms lifted as if to reach for me, then faltered, hovering like birds unsure of their perch. I saved her the indecision and stepped forward. The wool of her coat scratched against my cheek, her perfume still the same drugstore floral that had filled our kitchen decades ago. She sobbed once, quietly, and whispered into my shoulder, "I should have gone after you. I should have." Words spilled, verbs ran out, but her arms clutched with a strength that said the rest. Over her shoulder, Mark stood awkwardly, his stance cracked by something softer. "Dinah," he said, my name tasting strange in his mouth after so many years. He glanced toward the car, toward our father, then back at me. For once, there was no smirk to borrow, no script to lean on. He looked like a boy who had lost his place in a play and didn't know how to improvise. The car door opened slowly. My father swung his legs out, planted his feet on the gravel like each step demanded negotiation. He had thinned, his face hollowed by age and illness. The eyes that had once burned with certainty now searched the air as if the horizon had shifted without permission. He walked forward 3 steps, stopped, and raised his head to meet mine. I saw calculation flicker, the old rule book in his mind with no entry for this scene, a daughter exiled, who now stood taller than the name he once tried to bury. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His hands, those hands that had pointed, pounded, condemned, were empty. "General," he said at last, his voice brittle, as if the title itself cut him on the way out. Then softer, almost unfamiliar, "Dinah." It wasn't apology, it wasn't forgiveness, it was orientation. He had to locate me in the world before he could decide how to speak. Behind him, Albert waited, ledger tucked against his ribs, still as stone but watching everything. He gave me the smallest nod, the kind a fellow sentry offers after a long, cold watch. I inclined my head back, then turned to my father. The gravel crunched as he took another step closer. The air between us felt heavy, charged, as if every slammed door, every whispered rumor, every sleepless night had gathered here to witness. I spoke first because someone had to. "Thank you for coming," I said. The words were clean, unvarnished. Not sugar, not poison, just true. We walked up the drive together, the 4 of us, our steps out of rhythm, the crunch of gravel louder than any words. My mother clutched her purse like a lifeline. Mark kept his sunglasses in his hand now, eyes darting between me and the house as if searching for an escape. My father's breathing was measured, too deliberate, the sound of a man rationing strength. At the door, I paused, hand on the knob. For a heartbeat, I was 19 again, waiting for it to slam in my face. But this was my door, my house. My hand tightened, and I opened it wide. Warmth spilled into the cold. The scent of cinnamon rolls Emily had left waiting, the glow of lights across polished wood. "Come in," I said, and it was not invitation so much as declaration. Inside, the air shifted. Conversations from the reception hushed when we entered. Uniforms and neighbors' coats lined the hall, faces turned toward us with polite curiosity. My father stiffened under the weight of so many eyes. He had always loved being the center of a room when it was on his terms. Now, stripped of titles, he looked smaller in his own skin. Albert appeared, steady as ever, his ledger tucked under one arm. "Guests accounted for," he murmured. Then, louder, to the room, "Lunch is served in the dining room." His voice carried the authority of someone who knew the art of redirecting attention. Slowly, the murmur of conversation resumed, people drifting toward the table. We sat near the end of the long table, my family clustered awkwardly together, me across from them. Platters passed down the line, silverware clinked, and still the tension thrummed. Finally, my father cleared his throat. His voice was too loud, the tone too practiced. "Well," he said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is we move on." The words landed like stones in water, shallow ripples, no depth. I set my fork down carefully, the clink deliberate. "No," I said, not unkindly. The table stilled again. "We don't just move on, we tell the truth first." His eyes narrowed, the old pulpit cadence flickering in his expression. But I pressed forward, voice steady. "The truth is that you sent me out that night without a coat. The truth is that I learned to be warm by building a life that didn't require your permission. The truth is that Mom wrote me in secret when she could, and Mark pretended silence was loyalty. The truth is that I fed the hungry in this town, not because of your sermons, but because strangers showed me kindness when you wouldn't." The room was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, accusatory kind. It was attentive, like a congregation leaning forward when testimony matters. My father opened his mouth, then shut it again. His hands clenched and unclenched on the table. When he finally spoke, the words came halting, each one costly. "I was wrong," he said, the syllables brittle. "I was cruel. I thought I was protecting something that didn't need protecting, or maybe I was only protecting myself." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." It wasn't grand, it wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. And in that moment, it was enough to change the air. My mother made a sound like relief breaking through grief. Mark stared at his plate, jaw tight, then muttered, "I should have called. I should have done more than hope you'd survive without me." He lifted his eyes, shame raw in them. "I'm sorry, too." Emily, who had slipped into the room quiet as a shadow, stepped forward now. She set a plate of cinnamon rolls between us, her voice soft but clear. "We can eat," she said. "We can talk after, one thing at a time." The tension cracked, laughter rippling in fragments around the table, fragile but real. People resumed passing dishes, conversation picking up again in cautious tones. Across from me, my father's shoulders sagged, the weight of decades finally pressing down. I picked up my fork again, not to erase the truth I'd spoken, but to show that truth didn't mean the end of us. It meant the beginning. After the guests drifted out, leaving behind half-empty platters and the faint echo of laughter, the house settled into a quieter rhythm. The kind of quiet that asks for confessions. I guided my parents and Mark into the smaller sitting room off the foyer. No television, no distractions, just books, a window overlooking the magnolia tree, and the soft hum of the heating vents. Albert appeared with his unerring sense of timing, setting peppermint tea before my mother, black coffee before my father, and a glass of water for Mark. "Privacy," he murmured as he withdrew, ledger hugged to his ribs like a secret. For a moment, none of us spoke. My mother's hands trembled around her teacup, the steam fogging her glasses. Mark sat stiff, knees spread too wide, like a man trying to take up space he hadn't earned. My father cupped his coffee in both hands, eyes fixed on the dark liquid, as though the truth he needed to say might be written there. Finally, my mother broke the silence. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. I said it at the table, but I need to say it here, where it can land. She looked directly at me. I failed you, Dinah. I stood in that kitchen the night your father cast you out. I wanted to run after you. I didn't. I told myself it was godly to stand by my husband, but it wasn't godly. It was fear. She swallowed hard. I let fear decide for me, and I'm sorry. I shook my head, not to dismiss her words, but to soften them. You were afraid, I said quietly. So was I. The difference is I had to walk through it. Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she reached for my hand. This time I didn't pull away. Mark shifted in his chair, clearing his throat like he was about to speak in a courtroom. I told myself silence was neutral, he began, his gaze fixed on the carpet. I thought if I stayed out of it, I wasn't guilty. But silence is easier than standing up to Dad. I chose easy, his voice cracked, and I'm sorry. I studied him, searching for the smirk I had always known him to wear, the shield of arrogance. It wasn't there. He was just my brother, stripped bare. Thank you, I said simply. It was all the space I could give him for now. And then my father spoke. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, the pulpit thunder gone, replaced by something human. I thought righteousness required severity, he said. I thought if I showed you the cost of sin, I was protecting you. Turns out all I showed you was the cost of my pride. He closed his eyes once, then lifted them to me again. I don't know how to fix what I broke. I leaned back, steadying my breath. You can't fix it, I told him. We can only tell the truth about it, and decide how to live from here. He nodded, absorbing the boundary like a soldier learning a new command. Then he looked toward the door, where Emily had been lingering. She stepped inside, cautious but brave. My father's voice broke as he said, I'd like to meet my granddaughter properly, if she'll let me. The room stilled. I could have made him work for that privilege, listed every absence, every cruel word. But mercy hoarded spoils. She already knows your name, I said. She knows the whole story. It belongs to her as much as it does to us. Emily crossed the room and sat across from him, posture open, kindness measured. Hi, she said. Grandma tells the weather better than the news does. She says it's spitting instead of raining, and blustery instead of windy. I like that. My mother laughed through her tears, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. My father tried on a smile that trembled at the edges. I used to read the forecast on the local radio, he said, surprising us all. Your grandma would tease me if I said chance of showers too often in a week. Emily tilted her head, considering this. You're welcome to read our weather any time. We need more words for snow. The conversation turned softer after that, circling ordinary things. The price of eggs, the church potluck schedule, the way the library printed coloring pages for free on Fridays. It wasn't avoidance. It was scaffolding, building a frame strong enough to hold heavier truths later. When the winter sun dipped behind washed wool clouds, my mother rose, hesitant but brave. She took my father's hand, then placed it in mine. Please, she whispered, let us come for Christmas. Her words were simple, impossibly large. I didn't answer right away. Every instinct I'd honed, the command voice, the discipline, the triage, backed off and let something older decide. Yes, I said finally, but on my terms. No speeches, no rewriting. One plate at a time, one true story at a time. My father's shoulders dropped. Understood, he said, voice low, eyes wet but clear. I glanced toward Albert, who had returned silently, ledger in hand. Ma'am, he asked, shall I note reconciliation in progress? A laugh escaped me, weary but real. Yes, I said, but put it in pencil. We'll update as we go. Christmas Eve arrived in a hush, the kind of quiet that makes you believe the whole town has agreed to lower its voice. The sky was pewter, the air sharp with the promise of snow. I woke before the alarm, nerves thrumming in my chest. Downstairs, the tree lights glowed like patient stars. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, a fragrance both ordinary and sacred. Albert had been up even earlier. He'd lined the mantel with brown paper bags labeled in his careful block letters, beans, rice, pasta, destined for the food pantry. It's a season for full cupboards, he said simply, setting the last bag in place. Emily appeared from the kitchen, her hair messy, a mug of coffee in each hand. She pressed one into mine. Ready? She asked. I gave the only honest answer. I don't know, but I think we are. We spent the morning in the rhythm of 1,000 families, bickering lightly over oven space, ironing a tablecloth that would wrinkle the moment plates touched it, arranging oranges and peppermint sticks in a bowl. Emily hummed off-key carols, her voice both childlike and grown. I set out the chipped nativity I'd carried from place to place, a Joseph with a crooked staff, a camel missing an ear. Not valuable, but ours. At 2:47, early by our family's standards, the bell at the gatehouse rang. My pulse jumped. Tires crunched on the drive. Doors opened. I stepped onto the porch. My mother's scarf was festive red, bright against the gray day. Mark carried a pie with a lattice top, awkward as an apology. My father wore his good coat, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and hymns. "Come in," I said, and this time I meant it without hesitation. Inside, warmth wrapped around us. Emily met them at the door, 3 small envelopes in her hand. "For later," she said, passing them out. "No peeking." Her voice had that mix of mischief and ceremony only teenagers can manage. We ate early, nerves pretending to be hunger. The ham sliced neatly, the green beans declared perfect by my mother, though she admitted she liked them overcooked the way her mother used to make them. Mark took seconds without comment. My father chewed like a man studying for a test, each bite deliberate. After we cleared the table, Emily stood, her voice carrying authority far beyond her years. "All right," she said. "House rules for story time. 1, no speeches. 2, no rewriting. 3, truth first, tenderness close behind." She looked at me. "That's what you always said." We moved into the sitting room. Outside, the first snowflakes drifted past the magnolia tree, lazy confetti against the darkening sky. Emily handed out the envelopes. "On 3, she said. "We open together." She counted, and we tore. Inside each was the same photograph. Commissioning day, 2 decades ago. Me in uniform, Emily small beside me in her blue yard sale dress, her hand reaching for the insignia on my chest. My mother pressed a hand to her heart, tears spilling. Mark inhaled sharply, blinking hard. My father traced the outline of the silver bar with a fingertip, as if touch could carry him back through years he had squandered. "I wish I had been there," he said quietly. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was regret, raw and unvarnished. "You weren't," I said, steady. "But she was." I nodded toward my mother. She broke down then, crying the way some people pray, repetitively, as if each tear carried a verse. We took turns. Mark told a story about the chalk-lined baseball games of our childhood, how he used to accuse me of cheating because I always hit the ball over the hedge where the neighbor's dog would bury it. He smiled for the first time that day. "You weren't cheating," he admitted. "You were just better." He glanced at Emily. "Don't tell your mother I said that." My mother told a story I'd never heard. "That night you left," she said, voice trembling. "I pressed my hand to the kitchen window, trying to feel your shadow. I wanted to run after you. I didn't. I told myself obedience was godly. I was wrong." She squeezed my hand. "I am trying to be braver now." Finally, my father spoke. "I used to think forgiveness was something a pastor dispensed like a receipt," he said. "Tonight I understand it's a table you set, 1 plate at a time." His eyes glistened. "I won't ask for what I don't deserve, but if you'll show me where the plates go, I'll set the table." I rose, fetched the china, and handed it to him. He placed the forks opposite from where I would have put them. I let them stay wrong, because sometimes forgiveness looks like letting a fork be wrong for one night. Later, Emily brought out one last box, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She handed it to my parents. Inside was a framed collage of 3 photos, me at 19 on the bus stop bench, belly round beneath a too-thin coat, me on commissioning day with Emily by my side, and me recently, in uniform, star bright on my shoulder, my mother's hand resting on my sleeve, my father's head bowed, ever so slightly in respect. Beneath it, Emily had lettered, "Family isn't who never breaks your heart. It's who shows up with glue." My mother made a sound I will carry all my life. My father cleared his throat and gave up pretending composure. Mark blinked hard at the ceiling. Emily folded her hands, her eyes shining. We hung the collage in the hallway where no one could miss it. "Strategic," Emily said with a grin. Everybody visits the truth eventually. We laughed, not because it was funny, but because relief sometimes exits the body disguised as laughter. That night, candles flickered on the porch, the snow fell steady, and for the first time in 2 decades, my family sat together without armor. My father touched the frame once more before leaving, whispering, "Thank you." My mother kissed my cheek, murmuring, "You look beautiful." Mark shook my hand, his grip hesitant but real. As their taillights disappeared into the white, Albert closed the gate, ledger tucked beneath his arm. "Ma'am," he said softly, "shall I record reconciliation?" I smiled. Yes, but in pencil. Because reconciliation is never finished. It's updated one ordinary day at a time.